On this episode of Newt's World, on Monday, April 8th, the Biden administration released details of their new student loan debt forgiveness plan for nearly 30 million borrowers. The proposal still needs to be finalized and will almost certainly be challenged in court. However, Biden administration officials have said they could begin handing out some of the debt relief, including canceling up to $20,000 in interest as soon as this fall. The plan would reduce payments for 25 million borrowers and erase all debt for more than 4 million Americans. About 43 million people are carrying $1.7 trillion in student debt. Joining me to discuss the proposed new student loan debt forgiveness plan, I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Adam Kissel. He is a visiting fellow in the Heritage Foundation Center for Education Policy, and he previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Higher Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education. Adam, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, on Monday, April 8th, Biden unveiled this new student loan debt forgiveness plan that would help about 30 million borrowers erase some or all of their loans. What would the plan actually look like?
We haven't seen the details yet, but we do have some bullet points, and we've seen some documents out of what's called negotiated rulemaking, which would have a number of different features to it. One is that if your debt is higher after a couple of years than the amount that you originally took out, you're considered to have a kind of hardship that the secretary can use to waive your debt interest up to $20,000. So for people who have had debt over the course of many years, their interest payments and principal might be much higher than their original debt. And that could be because they've been in deferment and they've paid the minimum amount. And it's unclear whether they really have a hardship or not because they've just been on an income contingent repayment plan. But it doesn't matter to the Biden administration. They want to cut as much debt as they possibly can. And that's why up to $20,000 in interest for that category of borrowers would simply be wiped off of their debt and, of course, transferred to 100 million taxpayers who will be holding the bag for that. There are some other bullet points released by the administration that would be targeted at borrowers in other categories. So, for instance, if your debt has been in repayment for 20 or 25 years or more, then your debt might just simply be canceled. And again, canceled doesn't mean that it goes away. It becomes money that somebody else is going to have to pay. And then there's a third category that will also have many people in it, which is an accountability measure, which is that if you look at the debt a few years out after someone graduates and their income a few years out, you can calculate a debt to income ratio. And if that ratio is bad, and doing that program by program, college by college, if that ratio is bad, then you're perceived to have a low financial value degree. And if you're in a low financial value degree program, then you might have your debt canceled as well. So there are some smaller categories, but those I think are the three biggest. And then there's a catch-all, which is that if the secretary decides that you have a hardship for any reason, the secretary could cancel all of your debt. And one of the ideas that the secretary has proposed is that if you haven't been paying your student loans for a certain number of months, I guess you must have a hardship. So just imagine how that loophole will be abused. Those are the biggest parts.
How does this differ from the first Biden debt forgiveness plan back in 2022?
The earlier plan relied on the HEROES Act, which was meant especially for actual American heroes, people who say were serving in a foreign country and for some reason, perhaps because of a natural disaster, but because perhaps they've been in a war or conflict, that they haven't been able to pay their student loans on time. And that very specific exception was part of the original law. At a later point, the HEROES Act was amended so that anyone affected by a major disaster who specifically had a problem paying off their debt because of the disaster could have a certain amount of debt cancellation. But what the Secretary of Education did is decided that the entire United States was a disaster area because of the COVID-19 response. Therefore, every borrower in the world, but we'll separate the United States from the world, every borrower had some impact from the COVID-19 response. And therefore, they had, by definition, a hardship related to the disaster. And therefore, they were getting $10,000 or $20,000 cut off of their debt. That was a very specific misuse of a law. The current scheme doesn't use the HEROES Act at all, and we can talk about that.
The Supreme Court said that Biden clearly had exceeded his authority as defined by Congress in the HEROES Act. So, as I gather, apparently Biden's lawyers then went out, read the Supreme Court decision very carefully, and tried to figure out a new loophole that they could get all this money through. Now, you called the last plan under the HEROES Act, quote, a new socialism of higher education. Pay only what you can, the minimum amount vanishes towards zero, and the taxpayer will cover the rest. Do you really see this as that radical a break from any kind of merit-based system?
I do, and the lawsuit from 7 states against this latest plan helps us see why that's the case. So a student loan program is meant to be about helping people go to college. You take out a loan and you're responsible and you pay it back. And the current system says that for about every $10,000 of student debt, the government was making money back. People were encouraged to be responsible enough, and they would pay back about $10,500 for every $10,000 of debt. The new scheme does socialize higher education because we're all going to be paying, because for every $10,000 of debt, there's about only $7,000 that is expected to come back to the public treasury. So the loan program has been transmogrified into a grant program. And when you're talking about a transfer of money from one set of Americans to another, you've really taken a turn towards socialism. And this idea of free college is what the Biden administration is all about these days.
What is the new loophole? How have they decided that even though the court has said, no, you can't do it, they figured out a way you can do it?
Well, they still can't do it, so they're not going to win in court, is my prediction. But the HEROES Act was a very specific part of the law. That was the authority that the Education Department was using as its justification for the debt cancellation. But the new authority that they're using is not out of the HEROES Act. It's out of the Secretary's overall waiver authority to waive the rules when someone is a distressed borrower. And that idea is what the Education Department is using as a wedge to declare all kinds of borrowers as distressed borrowers. It did that for what's called the SAVE plan, which is for alumni who are on an income-based repayment plan, which we haven't talked about yet. And it's doing it prospectively for this so-called Plan B, but to me it's Plan C because of the SAVE plan option, to find 25 million more people and say that they are distressed borrowers and deserve a secretarial waiver of paying their student loans.
What is the theory of a distressed borrower? I mean, a person who just made a series of bad decisions, or a person who went into a low-income job, or what?
So the traditional idea of a distressed borrower is common sense. It's someone, say, who has declared bankruptcy or has extreme financial trouble in their life where they actually can't pay off their debts. It's not someone whose debt just happens to be higher than the amount that they took out, or who still has debt 20 or 25 years later. So even in the SAVE plan, the idea was that if you would benefit from paying a lower amount, then you must be a distressed borrower. So the term itself has been stretched beyond any reasonable recognition. So when a court looks at it, the court will say, that's arbitrary and capricious, that you can't say a distressed borrower is someone who's not distressed but will benefit from the new terms of the agreement.
They now have a number of steps they've got to take to actually try to implement it. On the bureaucratic side, what are the steps that the Department of Education has to do in order to try to actually get the money to people?
Well, under the HEROES plan, the main reason that the department lost was it was so lawless, it just declared what it was going to do. There was no process that included notice and comment of the public, which is normally required when the government is going to do something different from a regulatory point of view. And the major questions doctrine came in. So when there was something that was of huge political and economic significance, Congress had to authorize it, and Congress didn't authorize it. That's what we're going to see again. Congress has not authorized 25 million people to get $500 billion or $1 trillion of student debt forgiven. But what the department is trying to do is trying to at least get notice and comment from the public. So they've gone through what's called negotiated rulemaking, which is a special kind of rulemaking that is almost unique to the education department, where they go through a number of meetings with representatives of different groups, such as borrowers, such as national organizations that work on student debt issues. And they get representatives of all of those constituency groups in a room, and they try to come to consensus about a new regulation that would address an issue. So they brought a bunch of those people into a room. Of course, they had nobody from our side of the aisle who would think that student loan cancellation is bad from the beginning. They left us out, but they negotiated, and they still couldn't come to consensus. So what happens when the department can't come to consensus with these representatives of the public is they're completely free to write up their own regulation the way they want. So that's what's going to happen. They've been writing up their own regulation the way they want. They announced, especially through the president on Monday, they're going to do this, and this. And we have to wait to see what the exact text of the regulations are. Then the public has a chance to comment, hopefully 60 or 90 days, since there's so much going on. But the department could say 30 days. And if the department says 30 days, that will probably become part of the lawsuit because it's not enough time to read all of these pages of regulations. But at that point, they'll have their comments. They have to produce a final regulation which shows that they've addressed all of the public's comments and show why they did or didn't do what the commenters wanted. And if they do that badly, that would be another basis for a lawsuit because they're being arbitrary and capricious and not actually responding to the comments. But once they get through all of that, and it could be 100,000 comments, so it could take them months, or it could be a small number of comments. But once they do that, it becomes final, and then it will be subject to litigation, likely, maybe by 18 or 20 more states. And so likely it will then be put on hold while judges look at the details.
So is the current multi-state lawsuit about the first round of Biden giveaways, or is it about this new one?
What I called the Plan B in between. So in between the first round and this current round, there was a different round that was a revision of a particular income-based repayment program that has the acronym REPAYE, the REPAY program. They changed its name to the SAVE program, and they did that with only 30 days notice and comment. So it was arbitrary and capricious. And listen to what they did. The original plan said that 150% of the poverty line of your income would be exempt from this income-based calculation. The new rule was 225% of the poverty line would be exempt. In addition, additional categories of your income were excluded. So once they've done that, The next question is, how much of your disposable income do you have to pay? And the rule went from 10% to 5%. And then the next question is, how many months in a row do you have to pay before the rest of your debt is simply canceled? It used to be 20 years, and it was changed to 10 years. So you're basically getting about 85% off compared to the old plan. So 18 states are now saying that's bad for a bunch of reasons, and that's what they're suing over.
Is it very common to have this many states come together to file a lawsuit against the president?
It seems unprecedented to me. 18 states and 2 different lawsuits. You may know from your experience something different, but that sounds like about the highest number of states that have gotten together on anything in quite a while.
I mean, the other part of that is, as you pointed out earlier, it's not like they're wiping the debt out. They're transferring it.
Correct.
So it's actually going to end up being part of the national deficit. Well, all of us are going to pay interest on it. The study, at Wharton, that came out and said the plan would cost somewhere between $519 billion over 10 years and could rise to over $1 trillion. So, Biden is massively increasing the national debt across the board. And this is just one more example of borrowing from our children and grandchildren.
Absolutely. If you think about it, every $1 trillion is what? $3,000 per American citizen. So this is not just a question of dispersed costs and concentrated benefits. Even the dispersed costs come out to, say, $3,000 per person. So this is real money for every person, every taxpayer. And when only 25 million to 30 million people are getting some cancellation, and at least 70 million are going to have to pay for it, plus their kids and grandkids, the voter calculation doesn't come out as nicely as maybe the Biden administration thinks. So if they're thinking they're going to get a bunch of votes out of this, they have to remember there's tens of millions of people who are upset with this.
First of all, of course, when I went to school, I borrowed money, and it took me probably 15 years to pay it off. Calista had a similar experience. So I understand the notion of some level of personal responsibility. But isn't it true also that the way Biden is proposing it, there's no income limitation? So you can be a Harvard-educated lawyer making a couple $1 million a year, and you're suddenly going to have your loan paid off by the Treasury, by the taxpayer in effect. So some poor person out here working as a plumber or working at Wendy's is now going to have a burden because the $400,000 a year Harvard lawyer is being helped out by Joe Biden and by the entire Biden team.
That's completely right. That's why my colleagues and I at the Heritage Foundation call this a regressive scheme. And it's true that on the pay-for side, that a lot of the people who are paying taxes are paying more if they earn more. Nevertheless, it's true that lots and lots of, say, plumbers and folks who didn't go to college and people who chose to go into the military instead of having college debt, and people who were responsible and paid off their college debt, these categories and more are paying for, as you suggested, potentially the $400,000 a year Harvard Law School graduate at a white shoe firm, simply because they are pretended to have financial hardship by the education department and would qualify for one of these waivers.
You also have a situation where Biden is, I think, pretty desperate to get money to them before the election. I mean, it's basically just a classic old-time vote-buying gimmick. In your judgment, can they get through all the court challenges enough to actually get money to voters before the election?
I think there's very little chance that they will. They could get through the injunction phase fairly quickly if the Supreme Court is willing to look at the case before November. So, as you know, what will happen when there's a lawsuit is there'll be a request to put the new regulations on hold. And then you have to do a balance of harms and decide as well on the merits as quickly as you can figure them out, what would happen if we hold the regulation right now and don't forgive any debt? And I think the answer would be, if people have to pay on their student loans a few extra months, that harm is pretty low compared to simply giving away $500 billion. So I think there's a good chance that an injunction would find the balance of harms on the side of the 18 states, supposing all 18 of them sue again. It would be hard to get through all those levels of court, starting with the federal district court, an appellate court, and then the Supreme Court. Certainly not the whole case by November, but at least the injunction request. Now, does that matter for the Biden administration? Because they can still say, all of these red states have stopped you 25 million people, from getting the relief you deserve. Now, they don't deserve it, but that'll be the rhetoric of it. So simply having the lawsuit exist gives them a talking point. Can say, we're trying to help you, and the other side is trying to hurt you.
But as you pointed out a while ago, if you are not one of the people who is in the sort of Biden purchase plan, you may well resent the whole model. There may be more Americans. In fact, I think the only poll I've seen showed many more people opposed than favored it. And they've sort of figured out it's really a bad deal.
It is a bad deal, and that's why I've said that the voting calculation by the Biden administration may really backfire, because it's so expensive. Everyone sees how unjust it is, and besides the fact that it's unlawful, could have a lot of implication for people voting against the Biden administration, getting another bite at the apple, because they see this coming time after time, all of this lawlessness agency by agency, and it could well be a factor for people's decision about whether to come out to vote and then how to vote.
Well, and at the same time, it seems to me, you've got an overlay here. Harvard has, I think, close to $50 billion in their endowment, and they charge very high tuition. So you have to wonder, why is the average taxpayer now going to ship money to Harvard? You would think that people who were concerned about the poor would have had the opposite model. How do you get money from Harvard and send it to the poor? Instead, the Biden model is, how do we raise taxes on the poor in order to ship it to Harvard? Doesn't that strike you as like totally backwards?
It's pretty awful. So elite, rich universities like Harvard get, I don't know, billions and billions of dollars a year in federal funding and subsidy for research as well as tuition. And they do not need the tuition dollars at all, but they get it anyway. So what I believe that states as well as the federal government should do is cut off those subsidies that are not needed by rich universities. Taxing the endowment is socialism. That's wealth confiscation, but you can tax endowment income, and you can tax the non-educational part of a university's income, right? So universities have meal plans, they have housing plans, they get lots of money out of their medical work that they do through their hospitals. All of that should be taxed. And as much as I don't like taxation in general, I still think that the tax code should be fair across different kinds of organizations. And rich elite colleges like Harvard have been abusing that nonprofit exemption, but they really ought to be paying, I don't want to say their fair share, but they ought to be paying what other organizations pay.
When I look around, I realize you got people at places like Harvard or Yale or Princeton who are genuine socialists. So they're sitting there happy. They've got really good jobs. They're getting paid a lot of money. And their model is for everybody else in the country to subsidize them. Now, I mean, it's a nice gimmick if you can get it, but it strikes me it's so profoundly intellectually and morally wrong that it's kind of amazing that it hasn't been more aggressively taken on up to now.
You know, a few generations ago, we culturally put higher education on a pedestal. Those were the really smart people who were discovering things, teaching the next generation, and we gave them a lot of deference and academic freedom, and for the most part, they deserved it. But what's happened today, especially since October 7th and the disastrous response to what happened in Israel, we see legislators and regulators and the general public saying, that pedestal just really isn't deserved anymore. There needs to be some accountability. If faculty members are going to be socialists and activists instead of scholars, maybe it's time for there to be some accountability from the public. If they want to interfere with our democracy, using that term, if they want to get involved in the democracy and be activists, well, maybe the rest of us, the democracy, will start knocking on the gates saying, you're responsible to us for all these subsidies. We have something to say about what you're doing. If they went back to pure academia and stopped trying to change society and socialize it, maybe they wouldn't be seeing all of these outsiders coming in and saying, we don't trust you anymore.
We did a podcast recently with Open the Books, which is a very, very interesting organization that files Freedom of Information Act all over the place and actually has a website that lists all of these different places. We spent most of our podcast on the University of Virginia. But when you begin to look at the salaries the administrators are being paid, I think Stanford now has more administrators than there are students. Not just teachers. They're more just pure administrators who have nothing to do with the classroom. And all of this gets wrapped up in both what they charge the student, which Joe Biden is trying to pay off on behalf of the students, and they get it from the government in a whole range of grants. And so we're all told that we have some moral obligation to subsidize people who dislike America, despise free enterprise, have contempt for our culture, but would like us to pay them and subsidize them. It's quite extraordinary what they pulled off.
The main reason that places like Stanford or University of Virginia, or really almost every college in America, can dramatically expand its administration and have such large administrative bloat is that tuition dollars pay for it. Research overhead dollars pay for it too at a place like Stanford. But that money is not going into the classroom. That extra tuition dollar is going to some assistant dean of DEI, of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to make trouble for the faculty and tell them who they can hire and who they can't hire. So if we, and it's tough love, right? If we cut off the subsidies for student loans, then we can do something about the administrative bloat that Americans are paying for.
And I think in that sense, Biden went in exactly the wrong direction.
And not only that, this $1.7 trillion, it is going to still be there because a new wave of students will come in year after year and have more debt. So what the Biden administration is doing is nothing systemically, not even as a recommendation, to address the problem of increasing tuition and increasing student debt. Instead, these are all very big and expensive Band-Aids on a problem that ultimately Congress will have to solve.
I'm delighted that at Heritage you're working on this, because after the election, if we get a Congress that's interested in real reform and a president that's interested in real reform, they're going to turn to places like Heritage for specific implementation ideas. So, Adam, I think the work you're doing is laying the base for a renaissance and a much healthier higher education program. And I want to thank you for joining me, and I want to encourage our listeners to visit heritage.org, where they can read about the student loan debt forgiveness plan as it is released publicly in the next few months. And frankly, I worked with Heritage all the way back in preparing for Reagan, so I know how important Heritage is across the board on virtually every topic. And Adam, you are a great representative of that extraordinary institution.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you to my guest, Adam Kissel. You can read more about the Student Loan Debt Forgiveness Plan on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.